Hello everybody. I just found this video. It's really cool. It's called "The 5 Most Self-Defeating Statements from Christians." Um, and this guy seems pretty nice, you know. He doesn't seem too anti-theistic or too ridiculatory of Christians. So, that's good. And, by nice, that's what I mean. But, I want to help my fellow Christians out there learn how to argue against these claims. So, here we go. Oh, and also, just so you know, I don't completely disagree with all of these, but with all of these statements that he makes. So I'll let you know which ones I don't disagree with. Also, one more thing. I'll try to explain my thought process when I'm talking about his arguments. But if I can't, then I'm just going to, if I don't fully understand it myself, then I'll just skip that part. I'm still learning, and, nobody's perfect. So here we go.
I've done a few videos discussing statements and questions from theists. There are some statements that I've heard from Christians recently, though, that I think are actually counterproductive. They end up working against their position instead of for it. Why would people die horrible deaths for a lie?
So before I actually play what he says, I'm gonna say just that, yeah, that's not a good argument to make. It only works in a very limited number of circumstances, and people, oftentimes on my side, they try to extend that to all circumstances. So I've heard what he says and about it, and it's pretty much spot on. People die for a lot of stupid things, but I would say the one time that it is actually a valid argument is when you look at the people who were convinced to die for Christianity from the very beginning, without being promised anything super spectacular in this life, and not promised 72 virgins. That's how you can tell when a man-made religion, or when a religion is man-made, is when it is very beneficial for men in that sense. But for instance, a decade and a half after, or not even a decade and a half, less than a decade after the death of Jesus, Christians were dying for him. And that, I would say that argument really only works against people who are trying to prove that Jesus never existed, because it's sort of a ridiculous idea to assume that. Well, I've already made a video about that, so I'll just continue to show you what this guy says.
This is essentially the martyrdom argument, which implies that a person's death in the name of an idea helps to verify the validity of that idea. If given a moment's thought, though, it's clear that it doesn't. This question can be asked of every single religious martyr in the history of the world, and only strengthens the point that either your religion is right and all others are wrong, or all religions are wrong. I think that the latter is certainly more probable. Martyrdom only demonstrates that the martyr believes in their cause. It says nothing about the validity of the cause itself. All religious sects and groups have had martyrs, and if you consider that at best, only one sect of one religion could possibly be right, that means that the vast majority of religious martyrs have died in vain. The only point that this statement makes is that it's very possible to die for something that you genuinely believe to be true that simply isn't. God exists outside of space and time. Existence.
So I make this argument a lot. So, I've seen what he has to say. I'll let you guys hear what he has to say, and then I will respond.
A process, and all processes require time. In order for something to exist, by any normal usage of the word, time is a requirement. The word exists is a present tense usage of the word exist, and tenses are, of course, descriptions of time. Imagine that I told you that I have in my possession a bucket of gold that I've had for 0 minutes and 0 seconds. I've had it for no time at all. You would laugh at me and say that if I've had it for 0 time, it never existed at all, and you would be correct. Saying God exists outside of space and time is comparable to the bucket of gold analogy. If God exists for 0 time, he doesn't exist at all. Furthermore, God could not have created the very realm of time that is required for his own existence. I don't.
So, he's basically just, this is a fallacy of equivocation, apples and oranges, basically. He's talking about contingent versus necessary entities. Of course, entities that are dependent on time need time to exist. I mean, that's just, basic. But to say that entities that are not dependent on time need time to exist is just nonsensical. It's just nonsensical. The argument that time has to have had a beginning and therefore something has to have caused time, but the argument that something has to have a beginning and therefore something has to have caused time is basically saying that, or it's defining what we are talking about as something that is not dependent on time, because how can something that is dependent on time cause time? And then you could say the same thing about anything before the Big Bang. If his process of reasoning is correct, then you could say that anything before the Big Bang didn't exist, and there was no cause for the Big Bang, which is a completely unscientific claim, and it's where we get these ideas that he's about to bring up. I don't have enough faith to be an atheist. It's where we get that phrase from. It's a leap of blind faith to assume that the universe came from nothing, which is why scientists try to come up with hypotheses like the inflaton or the multiverse theory. Sorry, not multiverse, but what the universe generators that are not that don't have a brain behind them. Something has to have started time, and that thing, whatever it was, has to have been outside of time. And it's most probable that it was a god. So his argument is self-refuting, ultimately. And I don't think there's anything else for me to explain on that, so we will continue.
Don't have enough faith to be an atheist. Obviously, the first thing to clear up is the idea that atheists need faith. Atheism requires no faith. It is simply the default position of non-belief regarding the claim that a God exists when the claim has not been demonstrated to be true. The questions that I always ask myself are, why do so many Christians feel the need to argue that atheism requires faith? Why would they try so hard to prove that we have more faith than they do? If Christians really believe that faith is a virtuous concept, they wouldn't attempt to tear down another position on the ground that it supposedly requires faith. I think that this statement demonstrates that people that use it don't really think that faith is a virtuous concept, but rather something that can be used to demonstrate the weakness of a position.
So I would make 2 points on this. First of all, he doesn't. What he's doing here is he's just not really understanding what we mean when we say it. When we say I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and I don't personally say that, but I can understand the sentiment. And then the second thing, and I'll get more into that in a second, but the other thing is the word faith itself. Yeah, it's not a virtue the way atheists define faith. The way Christianity, or at least the Bible defines faith, is very different. It's more of how John Lennox defines faith, is trusting that God is good and God is loving, with the evidence that he's provided, sort of like how Abraham, he heard God, then he believed in God. So once he saw personal evidence of God, then he believed in God, and then his faith was considered, or he was considered to have had faith when God gave him an actual vision, and then he believed that that God's promise was going to come about. So faith itself is not defined as believing in something without evidence. What it is believing that God is actually an honest person. Basically, that's all it is. So yeah, the way atheists define faith, it is demonstrative of a weak argument. To have faith in something is demonstrative of a weak position. But when we say we don't have enough faith to be an atheist, that's not saying that, or I guess we are using your own definition of faith, really. What we're saying is that we're not, how should I put this? The faith of an atheist is the one of the ignorant atheists, I should say. The one that looks at, for instance, the universe and thinks that science can answer all questions, that sort of faith. And then when faced with certain concepts like the beginning of time, like I was mentioning before, they sort of just assume that nothing was there before, and there's nothing that created time, it just popped into existence, which is not what science claims, but that's essentially what many of them believe. And that's when you get into the idea of atheistic faith. And then there's another one. I can't think of the other one. But yeah, basically we're talking about, when we talk about that, we're talking about the ignorant atheist. And when we say we don't have enough faith to be an atheist, we're just saying that we have seen the evidence on both sides, and it leans much more strongly in favor of theism. And if we're a Christian, then obviously we're saying Christian theism. So that's, I would say, just a misunderstanding on his part about what we mean when we're saying that, and possibly an error of equivocation between the two meanings of faith on our side and their side. Okay. Continuing.
God has a plan. I think that most people have heard someone say this in a time of crisis or loss. I know that I've heard it at funerals more than a few times. The person saying it seems to be implying that this tragedy occurred as part of God's divine plan, which is outside of our comprehension. It also implies that if this God exists, he needs people to fight his battles and try to explain away tragedy. The obvious question that follows from this statement is, what kind of loving God allows tragedy to occur in the first place? It's a question asked by believers and non-believers alike. It puts the problem with the proposition of an omnipotent God that intervenes in human affairs back into the spotlight. As Sam Harris puts it, either God can do nothing to stop catastrophes like this, or he doesn't care to, or he doesn't exist. God is either impotent, evil, or imaginary. Take your pick and choose wisely.
So this is really the only time where it seems like he's being a bit disrespectful, which, no fault of his. He's generally respectful-ish throughout the entire video. God has a plan. That whole idea is, it just goes back to the whole faith thing, trusting that God is a good God, and that he keeps his promises. When tragedy does strike, we have to find solace in the fact that he is a good God, and the idea that those three are the three choices out there. He's either impotent, or he's not good, or he doesn't exist. That would be, well, what would you call that? It's a fallacy. I forgot the name of it, but there's a fourth option, and that's the fact that God is good. The idea that God is good, and that he allows tragedy, is very hard for people to comprehend, I think. And that's just because they're looking at it in a very simplistic manner. Because a good God would... a good God, at least a good God of the Bible, would have given us free will. And if God is good, then obviously being given a choice between good and evil as a human leads to some people making choices in the more evil direction. And if God is good and he ordered the universe, then evil will necessarily lead to chaos in the universe, and chaos leads to death and destruction. So it's pretty easy logic to follow once you really think about it. Is tragedy strikes because we have free choice, and some people chose evil, and this has a more like a domino effect throughout the world. And so he gave those three options, and there's really a fourth one. It's God is good, and if God is good, then tragedy will strike almost every human being. Then you get the faith aspect, where you read the Bible and you see that God promises that there's going to be a greater reward for those who suffer through tragedy and maintain their integrity and their trust in God. So that's when the faith comes in, and we say, okay, God has a plan. Okay, sure. And even if I die never knowing that plan, he'll explain it to me in the afterlife. Because, well, the Bible doesn't explicitly say that, but I assume we'll be able to ask him why certain things happened. And that's one of those just assumptions. Okay, next.
They're not real Christians. Many times when I've confronted Christians with fundamental ideals of a different Christian denomination, their defense is to say, well, they're not real Christians. Of course, the first problem with this statement is that it's the no true Scotsman fallacy, redefining a term or criteria in a biased manner to avoid counter-argument. For example, no Christian believes in purgatory. Catholics believe in purgatory. Well, no real Christian believes in purgatory, so Catholics aren't real Christians. Or, no Christian believes that Jesus Christ will return to Missouri during the second coming. Well, Mormons believe that Jesus will return to Missouri. Well, no real Christians believe that Jesus will return to Missouri, so Mormons aren't real Christians. Aside from the obvious fallacies in this statement, it causes people to consider more important questions that they may not otherwise consider. Like, what is a true Christian? Does anyone actually know the answer to this? This statement really only points out how much internal conflict that there is in Christianity. How can they sufficiently defend a position if they can't even internally agree on the most basic and fundamental principles of their own religion? Hi, this is Rob.
Okay, so I guess a lot of Christians probably do use this as a true Scotsman fallacy, or no true Scotsman fallacy. But this is one thing where, yeah, we would have to get down and actually define our term as Christian. And for instance, when I'm arguing with anybody who's an atheist, I would define a Christian as someone who is Christ-alike, because that seems like the obvious definition. So then you can extrapolate from, or extend from there. As far as Catholics and Mormons, it's kind of funny because those are probably the worst examples to bring up, but some of them. But he's right in the idea that if we are using that as a no true Scotsman, then don't do that. It's a fallacy, and it's only trying to skirt the issue. But let's see, what else did he say in there? Let me go back a bit.
Will return to Missouri during the second coming.
Not sure that part.
Well, Mormons believe that Jesus will return to Missouri. Well, no real Christians believe that Jesus will return to Missouri, so Mormons aren't real Christians.
Correct.
Aside from the obvious fallacies in this statement, it causes people to consider more important questions that they may not otherwise consider. Like, what is a true Christian? Does anyone actually know the answer to this?
Yes, we do know.
This statement really only points out how much internal conflict that there is.
Right, the internal conflict. That's one way of looking at it, because there is a lot of internal conflict, but another way you could look at it is there's a lot of freedom within Christianity. There's a lot of variety of doctrines, and that's good, because if you don't have a variety of doctrines, then it becomes just dogma. And, a lot of people dogmatically hold to particular doctrines, but the idea that you have to be uniform in order to be unified as a faith is it's just not true. There's a variety of doctrines. I wouldn't know if you would call them doctrines, but a variety of beliefs and doctrines within atheism, and you don't say that implies internal conflict and thus invalidates the entire movement or worldview. And there's a lot of variation in doctrines within science as well. But again, that doesn't invalidate the claim itself. It just means that there's a lot of freedom of thought within the group of people itself. And if Christians are using this just to sort of skirt the issues, then that is a problem. But we can define what a Christian is, and that is someone who believes and acts Christ-like. And if you go off of that, and then you can interpret what that is in a variety of different ways. But that at least allows us a starting point. And of course, as one of the lead members of the Church of the Former Day Saints, the Messianics and everything, we would say that Jesus was Jewish, and therefore we have to go back to what that means in order to define what it means to be Christian. But you know, it would be, you'd have to define your definitions ultimately, and we should do that, just to nail it down and iron it out. I'm not going to do that here though, because that would take too long, and I would need to think about that a lot more. So yeah, there you go. Those are the five most self-defeating statements from Christians. I would say the first one is a bit self-defeating. The other four, they can be self-defeating depending on how you use it. And that's why you have to be smart about this and learn from your mistakes. Because if you do use it, I've used some of those before in the wrong way, and it is self-defeating when you do that. So you have to learn from your mistakes and move on from there. That's what we do. We grow smarter as we get older, and we just gain more experience. And I think I have respect for this guy. Let's cover that. No. He seems to be doing this without a condescending tone, which you don't find too often. I was watching this one video about this pastor that brought an atheist to his church just to ask questions, and not to debate, but to ask questions. And I looked through the comments, and pretty much everything, 99% of it were just atheists, just going off on Christians for having a talk to an atheist event, like there's some freak show to discuss or something like that, and it's just ridiculous, because when we do try to have the conversation, we get ridiculed for it. When we ridicule them, they have fodder, and in there, I guess when you look at it, we're in a position of we're in a lose-lose position when we argue with them. But I would say, the best approach would always be to approach them respectfully. Of course, I don't always do that. I'm still learning. But approach everyone that you just talk to with respect and dignity, because, they are made in the image of God. So even though they might have different conclusions, you should still at least try to reason with them in a respectful manner. And then you have what a lot of the Psalms say, and that's another discussion for another day. Have a good night, everybody.